keeps42. Or just click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/42. And a big thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Tourism is one of the most hypocritical industries in the world. Most people will mouth off incessantly about how tourism is a plague on their city and regale about its many evils. Then those same people will go to bed that night dreaming of their upcoming vacations to Rome, Barbados, or Blackpool. But what's the truth? Should we be limiting tourism, or should we be squeezing every dime out of our cultural centres and natural beauty spots? Well, the answer might surprise you, and if you watch until the end of this video, you might never feel the same way about tourists ever again. Our world is truly special. Not only do we have more natural beauty than one man can see in a lifetime, but as a species, we've spent the past few thousand years crafting a tapestry of culture. We have etched that culture, our collective human story, into buildings. Buildings that have created cities. Cities that have told stories. Stories that have been retold through plays, books, and films, and shaped the way we live our lives today. So it's hardly surprising that almost everyone has a desire to go and see these cities, buildings, and stories firsthand. International tourism didn't actually exist, at least not on a large scale, until the 18th century. For thousands of years, people lived their lives mostly locally, rarely stepping foot out of their hometowns. Then, in the 1700s and 1800s, young upper-class men would embark on what is known as a grand tour, usually at the age of 21. It was basically the first example of what we know today as a gap year. It was seen as a way to round out a young man's knowledge and character and instill him with culture in a way that reading books just can't do. Oh, they also had a lot of sex along the way. Truth be told, that was probably the main attraction. Lord Byron was one of the most infamous grand tourists. He spent more than 2 years shagging his way around Europe. There were a few popular routes, but they almost always started in London. After a ferry to France, the spunky young tourist would typically make his way to Paris, Lyon, Bern, Venice, Florence, then Rome. But other routes went through Germany and Austria, or Spain. International tourism was restricted to the middle and upper classes for centuries, culminating in the golden age of cruising in the 1950s. However, it wasn't until the proliferation of cheap air travel that the working class could finally escape the dreary British weather and even drearier seaside resorts for a spot of sun in places like Spain, Italy, and Greece. In the 1980s and 90s, budget airlines such as Ryanair and EasyJet began offering cheap as chips seats on short-haul European flights.
Thanks, Andy.
You know, Interac can help your business expedite high-value payments in real time.
So I can instantaneously transfer funds with immediate confirmation?
With rich remittance data for easy reconciliation.
At Interac, we geek out on your business.
Today, you can fly from London to destinations like Paris, Rome, and Berlin for less than the price of your evening meal when you arrive. Over the following 50 years, tourist arrivals, especially in Europe, exploded. Overwhelming numbers of Chinese tourists in the past decade has also been a huge contributor to these stats, since China's middle class has been ballooning since 2000. Of course, it didn't take long before these millions of tourists had a profound effect on our planet. Take Amsterdam. It's one of the great cultural and historic centres of the world. But the city centre, particularly the red light district, is now full almost every night of the year with what have been deemed as party tourists. Every day, a deluge of stag doos descend on this den of delights like sex-craved denizens during the last days of Rome. They litter, throw beer bottles and other trash into the canals, start fights, cause excessive noise, and urinate in places you wouldn't even have thought were possible. The problem has grown so bad that the city of Amsterdam has actually started an online ad campaign to dissuade them from arriving. When men between 18 to 35, particularly British men, search online for terms like Stag Do Amsterdam or Pub Crawl Amsterdam, they'll be met with paid ads, literally telling them to stay away. The Greek island of Santorini is one of the most beautiful lumps of volcanic rock on our blue planet. It Citizens are surprised that 2 million people come here every year. But Santorini is also a small island with a population of just 15,000. And the winding streets are super narrow. In some places, only one person can fit down at once. And so, a visit to Santorini in the peak months results in a line of thousands of people who are literally queuing to walk down a street. Furthermore, most of the day trippers arrive at Santorini on a cruise ship that pollutes the azure waters of this otherwise serene sanctuary. Santorini is one of the most Instagrammed places on the planet. But behind every perfectly framed Insta, just out of shot, is an army of tourists all pushing each other out of the way to get the exact same photo. Now, you may assume that over-tourism is relatively harmless. After all, we can clean up the litter that crowds leave behind, we can repair superficial damage, we can do our best to cleanse polluted waters. But if the trend of surging tourist numbers continues to increase as it has, we might find that those marvels making people come in their millions might not last to marvel at for much longer. Because the world's most visited tourist spots all have one thing in common. Really old shit. Whether it's Istanbul's Hagia Sophia, Athens' Parthenon, Egypt's pyramids, or basically everything in Rome. And the problem with really old stuff is that it's incredibly fragile, and all of them are now under a very real threat of erosion from human activity. Every year, the Italian government spends millions on maintaining and restoring the Colosseum. But there's only so much that can be done. Ever-increasing car traffic around the ancient amphitheatre has caused a layer of black soot to form all over its exterior, which recently had to be cleaned up at great expense. Vibrations from the daily hordes of tour groups cause minor instabilities in the structure of the concrete and travertine walls and floors, causing very small fragments to break off as dust. Although minor, over time this erosion takes its toll, and the more tourists that pass through these harrowing corridors, the faster it will crumble. Then there's the unavoidable fact that for every 1,000 respectful tourists, you're going to get 1 or 2 "see you next Tuesdays." Like the 2 women from California who, only a few years back, decided to sneak away from their tour group to carve their names into the walls of the Colosseum. Now, because they were highly intelligent life forms, they also made sure to take selfies with their handiwork and upload it to social media. So everyone, including the Italian police, could see just how magnificently worthless humans they are. Of all the historical artifacts, Machu Picchu is probably one of the worst victims of human erosion. UNESCO has recommended a limit of 2,500 visitors per day to this Incan citadel. But during peak months, the actual number is more than double. Some tourists clamber on the stones, which are vulnerable to being dislodged since they were built without the use of mortar, which is ironically one of the main draws of this place. Presumably, the Incas thought that building Machu Picchu, the best part of a 4-day hike away, would dissuade most people from visiting it. But that didn't bloody work, did it? If tourist numbers continue to increase, Machu Picchu may be a shell of its current state in just a few decades. But Machu Picchu is symptomatic of hundreds of other old, vulnerable, well-trodden sites all over the world. From Stonehenge to Petra, we humans are slowly but surely stepping all over our own history, stomping it back into the ground. So, what's the solution? Well, there are some options that often get bandied about, but the truth is, I don't particularly like any of them. And I'll tell you why. We could firstly restrict access to historic sites, either by banning tourists altogether or by only allowing researchers and academics to visit them. But I'm sure that you, like I, would find it a little sad if only certain individuals could enjoy the majesty and wonder of the collective history of our species firsthand. Such a solution smacks of elitism, and it would result in only those with the right connections or birth or from certain elite universities being able to enjoy such places. Personally, I think that everyone should be able to stand in the Roman Forum and breathe in the air in the beating heart of the most significant empire in our history. Every man, woman and child should have the right to clamber over the basalt columns at Giant's Causeway and experience Mother Nature's perplexingly precise magic unfolding beneath their feet. Others would argue that we should simply charge people more to visit popular sites. Tourist taxes already exist in most popular cities, from Venice to Barcelona to Dubrovnik. Couldn't we simply increase these taxes and introduce similar fees in destinations that don't have them already? Shouldn't we vastly increase the ticket prices to ring-fenced attractions like the Acropolis, Sagrada Familia, and the Tower of London? Well, yes, we could, but it wouldn't solve the problem. People would still stump up the cash. People treasure their yearly vacations very highly, and for good reason. For most people, it's their only escape from routine, and it may be the only reason they work so hard in the first place. If they have the desire to go, people will find a way. This solution is also very similar to the last in that it encourages elitism. Those who can afford the new higher prices will still go anyway, and many of those who can't will probably still go, but it will just hurt them a lot more. They may have to take out loans or put these new travel expenses on high-interest credit cards. Travel is already expensive enough as it is. And don't get me wrong, it should be pricey. Travel is a luxury, not a right. And there are hundreds of people within the travel system, from taxi drivers to cleaners, who need to be paid a fair wage. But we shouldn't be artificially inflating prices just to keep the so-called riffraff out and to artificially reduce tourist numbers by limiting financial accessibility. People of all incomes and backgrounds should have the opportunity to visit at least some of these special places at some point in their lives. And what if I told you that almost every argument I've made in this video so far might be a straw man argument? What if over-tourism isn't so much of a problem, but an asset?
It's quite the parking job. Mom, what are you doing?
It's for the insurance.
Submitting and tracking a claim on the Bel Air Direct app is simple. Much simpler than trying to park.
The media loves nothing more than to chastise tourists, writing damning alarmist headlines about the damage they're causing, and live our lives within our own four walls, or else the planet will be destroyed and Greta Thunberg will come round and whip you. Meanwhile, those very same journalists probably enjoy their 5 or more vacations a year, jostling with the same crowds that they railed against only a month earlier in their weekly column. Because it turns out that over-tourism may not be such a bad thing after all. In fact, the very term over-tourism might be a bit of a misnomer. Here's why. The biggest benefit to tourism is that it's a powerful economic engine, and it provides some locations with a much-needed income injection. A whopping 10% of Italy's GDP comes from tourism. That's huge. In Greece, it's 11.5%, and Spain is 12.4%. Tourism is a huge creator of jobs in countless towns and cities of all sizes across the world. Only 50,000 people might live in Venice these days, but the tourism industry supports 70,000 jobs in the city. Venice will soon charge day trippers to enter, despite the fact that a whopping 30% of the city's revenue comes from day trippers alone, and that's not factoring in all the other tourists who stay overnight. I mentioned earlier that sites like the Colosseum are being eroded by human activity, usually from a combination of foot traffic and vehicles. And don't get me wrong, it is a concern. But do you really think that the Colosseum would still look as magnificent and relatively unchanged over the past decades as it does today, if it weren't for the huge amount of money it generates each year? Ticket sales alone bring in about 100 million euros each year, but it goes further than that. Financial consultancy firm Deloitte estimated that the Colosseum actually contributes about 1.3 billion euros each year to Italy's economy. It costs a few $1 million each year to maintain this building, a fraction of what it earns. Some of those who are employed to work on it are world experts in restoration, stonework, and archaeology. Do you really think that this building, and many others alike, would be babied to such an extent if it didn't act as such a powerful crucible of capitalism for its mother country? And there's another positive byproduct of tourism that is often overlooked by the naysayers: emotional power. Travel is usually a positive experience, and it creates many happy memories. This creates an emotional bond between a person and a place. You get warm, fuzzy feelings when you remember that childhood trip to Spain with your parents. Perhaps your spouse proposed to you next to the canals of Amsterdam, or Bruges, or Venice, or Birmingham, and you still said yes. Maybe you just yearn to be taken back to that summer you spent traveling the Italian countryside, as you enjoyed all the heady aromas and tastes that you can still experience in your mind as though it was yesterday. If you weren't allowed to or couldn't afford to visit these cities, monuments, and great wildernesses firsthand, we would never develop such strong emotional connections with them. It's really difficult to fall in love with the labyrinthine backstreets of Barcelona by just reading about them in a guidebook. And because of a deep love for and feeling of connection to these places that we've been, people regularly and routinely donate money to repair buildings, maintain landscapes, and clean up city streets. People who don't even live in said city. International organizations are also incentivized to put money and effort into protecting the places that people love the most, such as UNESCO, ICOMOS, and others. You could think of it like this. By inviting the world in to share these special places, it creates a global awareness and shared love for those places, which imbues them with a sort of protective bubble. When we hear stories of people defacing the Colosseum, like I mentioned earlier, people lose their collective shit. Almost every major newspaper worldwide reported on that story. It's funny, isn't it? The Colosseum is just a concrete building, but it's universally loved and adored, and millions of people around the world would have quite a lot to say and take significant action if it was ever seriously threatened. And it isn't just the big hitters, the Colosseums and Eiffel Towers of the world, that benefit from tourism. There are small towns and villages dotted all over the globe that are supported primarily by, or sometimes wholly by, tourism.
I chose Wix for my business because of its massive scope for functionality and freedom of creation. Being able to integrate and change and develop at my own pace. I offer a range of products and services. To manage it all from one place is essential. It gave me time back in my day to get going on actual projects. It really just made everything feel more achievable.
Since the Industrial Revolution, a well-documented phenomenon has been taking place: an exodus of smaller population centres towards larger population centres. It still happens today, and it's a trend that shows no sign of stopping. When young people reach working age, a large percentage of them will up sticks from their sleepy town or quiet country village and make haste to the big smoke. Whether it be London, Paris, or New York, you've probably noticed it yourself within your friendship circle. But tourism can help to stem that bleeding. It provides job opportunities and even self-employment for people of all ages in the places they grow up. From restaurants that are only open because of the local tourist trade, to tour operators. Welcome to the charming village of Hallstatt, Austria. It used to enjoy a thriving economy from the production of salt. But demand dried up, and the town's very existence was threatened. However, come the 21st century, this crumbling community was thrown a tourism lifeline. As interest surged, so did the crowds. This town of only 800 residents now receives a staggering 3 million yearly visitors, who flock to enjoy the breathtaking scenery on the skywalk, descend into an underground salt mine, and stroll through the quaint old town. In 1997, Hallstatt was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The locals might despise the crowds today, but they create jobs, opportunities, and although they do degrade the town, they also indirectly maintain it. It's fair to say that without them, this town, without any other notable industry, would be a shadow of its former self. And it isn't alone. There are countless similar examples all over the world of places that have been saved from the brink of extinction by tourism. Think of Whitby in the UK, Bruges in Belgium, and Greece's Santorini. Some people like to believe that these historic places, without tourism, can always look the same, function the same, and remain as quaint little fishing or farming villages for all eternity. And nothing would ever crumble or stop working, and nobody would ever leave, and the locals would be forever happy and well off. And if we could simply remove the tourists, then the status quo from 50 years ago would return overnight. But often, that's a pipe dream. The world has changed. Industry has changed. The way we live, work, and travel has changed. If these places didn't adapt to and pander to tourism, some of them would become dilapidated. Want proof? Before all those budget airlines came along, in the Victorian era, it was popular for the British working class to holiday in British seaside resorts like Blackpool, Morecambe, Margate, Rhyl, and many others. All of these places have seen a precipitous decline in tourist numbers over the past 50 years. Due to cheap air travel, the British have instead opted to seek warmer weather abroad, which has perfectly correlated with the social and economic decline of seaside resorts all up and down the nation, many of which now struggle with unemployment, homelessness, drugs, and crime. I'm not saying the story would always be the same if you remove the tourists from any town or city. There are, of course, countless small villages and towns all over the world that thrive with zero tourists. But once tourism has embedded itself into a community's prosperity, one should remove that tourism with great care, because the outcome is rarely a pretty one. Whether we like it or not, tourism is here to stay. The global population is increasing. The middle class is growing in developing countries, enabling them to travel more than ever before. So just maybe, instead of chastising tourists, we should find a way to balance our world's precious natural and cultural heritage with people's desires to experience it firsthand. If we can achieve that goal, then everyone wins. And as a tourist, we should travel with great care and respect for other people, cultures, and places. Because the more we respect others, the more we will be welcomed to new places with open arms, instead of placards telling us to stay away. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.
You can be this happy too with endless TV shows, movies, and more.
Its greatest territorial extent, and construct some of its most impressive monuments and artifacts. Despite recapturing Memphis, its kings saw no reason to move the capital again, and so they now once again ruled from the city of Thebes, far up the river in Upper Egypt. By now, Egypt had also adopted the technology of the horse-drawn chariot from their Hyksos foes, and its armies were now made up of powerful contingents of these vehicles. During these centuries, Egypt saw the rule of its first great woman pharaoh, Hatshepsut, who was one of its most prolific builders. She constructed the towering temple complex at Karnak and the stately mortuary temple known as the Holy of Holies. She also undertook a voyage in 5 ships to the land of Punt, somewhere in Africa, and brought back incense trees and other goods to Egypt, which she celebrated in one inscription.
The ships returned with the marvels of the land of Punt, and with all the good woods of Tanuta, with heaps of incense, with trees producing green fragrance, with ebony and pure ivory, with gold and green agates found in the land of the Amu, with hides of the panthers of the south. Never since the beginning of the world have the like of these wonders been brought by any king.
The new kingdom would also see some of the most striking dramas emerge in the royal courts of Egypt. Of these, none have drawn so much attention as the story of one pharaoh. He has been described by some as a revolutionary, by others as a visionary, and by others still as simply insane. He was a ruler named Amunhotep IV. Amunhotep came to the throne around 1350 BC. He had inherited his name from his father, who had ruled as Amunhotep III. Like most Egyptian names, it included the name of a god, Amun, and it meant Amun is satisfied. Amun had long been the god of the city of Thebes, and was considered the god of fertility and of the wind. But when the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, and Thebes became the capital once more, this god Amun was given something of a promotion. He was unified with the sun god Ra to create a compound deity now known as Amun-Ra, the perfect symbol of the power of a new, united Egypt. Amun-Ra was depicted as a man bearing a golden staff and wearing a high crown, and later would be shown with blue skin. This new deity was placed at the head of all the various gods that the Egyptians worshipped, the king of the gods and creator of the universe. One hymn to Amun-Ra describes the primacy of his position.
Lord of truth, father of the gods, maker of men, creator of all animals, Lord of things that are, creator of the staff of life.
The pharaoh Amunhotep IV would keep his name for the first 4 years of his rule, but around his 5th year on the throne, he made the unprecedented decision to change his royal name. That's because he had a vision of a new system of belief that he wanted to spread over all of Egypt. He wanted to do away with the messiness of Egyptian religion and the system of different gods in different cities, different temples and cults and priests. He devised a new system of worship that focused not on any god, but on the sun itself, which he seems to have believed was his true father. This new god would be depicted as a bare, impersonal disk, showering the earth with beams of light. It would be called simply the Orb, or in Egyptian, the Aten. One surviving hymn to the Aten, perhaps even written by the pharaoh himself, shows the enormous power this new god was supposed to have.
سخبر مايو إن حموت إرمو إمرمت سعن خصا إمغتن موتف سجرح السو
O sole God, like whom there is no other, thou didst create the world according to thy desire. You are in my heart. There is no other who knows you. Every land chatters at his rising every day.
إوثايم سوحت مدوم إنر ديك إن فثاو.
Around year 5 of his reign, the pharaoh Amunhotep abandoned his old name that paid respect to the god Amun and changed it to a new name for his new god. This new name meant effective spirit for the Aten. He was now the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten is the first recorded person in history to have started a new religion by himself. He was also the first monotheist. In Akhenaten's kingdom, only the Aten could be worshipped. Temples to Amun were eventually shut down, and all worship of the former god was banned. The king even sent out workmen and soldiers to all corners of Egypt, where they burst into temples with hammers and chisels and chipped the name of Amun off the walls. His determination to rid his kingdom of Amun was so great that he even sent workmen climbing to the top of the Red Pyramid of Snefru to chip the name of Amun from the pyramid's topmost capstone. To the Egyptians, used as they were to placating a whole host of deities with prayers and offerings, this radical shift must have seemed like a frightening and risky gamble. Many must have feared to turn their backs on their old trusted gods and consort with this new and untested ideology. But the king's word was the king's word, and for the most part, they seem to have fallen into line. At first, Akhenaten converted old temples in Thebes to the Aten, and even began constructing some new ones, but he soon went off the idea. Thebes' old temples were covered with carvings and hieroglyphs praising the other gods, and the depth of their history couldn't be erased overnight. Thebes was also home to a powerful priestly class that resisted his reforms. In answer to this problem, Akhenaten took the remarkable decision to build an entirely new capital. He would build it out in the middle of the desert, at a completely uninhabited location halfway between Memphis and Thebes. He would call this city the Horizon of the Aten, or in Egyptian, Akhetaten. Standing out on the bare and level plain where he hoped to build his new city, the pharaoh Akhenaten gave the following proclamation to his courtiers.
The Aten desires that there be made for him a monument with an eternal and everlasting name. It is Aten, my father, who gave me counsel concerning it. No official has ever given me counsel, not any of the people who are in the entire land. At Akhetaten, I shall make the house of Aten.
This new city would be furnished with everything a royal capital needed. Palaces for Akhenaten and his chief wife Nefertiti, along with his 4 other wives, gardens, tombs, administrative buildings and workshops, and of course a vast temple complex to the new god Aten. Construction of this city would take at least 8 years, and when it was finished, in the 12th year of his reign, Akhenaten held a magnificent ceremony. The year was 1342 BC. At his new capital, Akhenaten received delegations from all over the region, from the Hittites, from Syria and islands in the Mediterranean like Cyprus and Crete, as well as from the Nubian lands of Punt and Kush in the south, all here to bear witness to the glory of his new city and his successful conversion of his empire. The priests may have grumbled, the common people may have fretted, but he had finally done it. The ceremony must have been grand, full of celebration and pomp, musicians and dancers, the burning of incense and feasts of fine foods. We can imagine the foreign guests listening to the singing of hymns like the following to the new god Aten.
Thou didst create the world according to thy desire. All men, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth going upon its feet, and what is on high, flying with its wings. The countries of Syria and Nubia, the land of Egypt, thou settest every man in his place. Thou suppliest their necessities, Their tongues are separate in speech, and their natures as well. Everyone has his food, and his time of life is reckoned.
But the consequences of this piece of royal pageantry were dire. A plague had been spreading around the Middle East for some time now, affecting lands in Syria and the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey. One group of texts written around this time, known as the Hittite plague prayers, invoke the gods to deliver them from this disaster.
For 20 years now, people have been dying in Hatti. Will the plague never be removed from Hatti? I cannot control the worry in my heart. I can no longer control the anguish of my soul.
With foreign dignitaries coming from all over the region, with large entourages and doubtless groups of slaves in tow, a deadly dose of this disease arrived that year in the heart of Egypt, and from there would have spread all up and down the Nile. If Akhenaten had hoped that this ceremony would secure his people's confidence in his new god, then it couldn't have backfired more dramatically. In the pandemic that followed, no one was safe. Numerous deaths may even have occurred within Akhenaten's family, perhaps including his mother, his wife, and 3 of his daughters. And if the situation was so severe, even in the relatively protected royal court, we can assume that in the population at large, the effects were even more devastating. For the people of Egypt, this incomprehensible disaster must have seemed like the judgment of the old gods on the man who had so arrogantly turned his back on them. Akhenaten died only a few years later, around 1335 BC, after 17 years of rule. After his death, some members of his family attempted to maintain the cult of the Aten in the now plague-ravaged new capital of Akhetaten. They would take turns to rule for the next 4 years, but seemingly without much success. Now the whole empire seemed like it was teetering on the brink of collapse. But eventually, one of Akhenaten's sons, a boy of only 8 years old, came to the throne. His father had given him the hopeful name Tutankhaten, or living image of the Aten, but he would not rule under it for long. Turning his back on his father's new faith and to enormous celebration around the empire, in the 3rd year of his rule, he changed his name to the one we now remember him by, the living image not of Aten, but of the old god Amun, now triumphantly welcomed back by the people of Egypt. His name was Tutankhamun. As symbolized by his change of name, the boy king Tutankhamun rode back a great number of his father's attempted reforms. He ended all worship of the god Aten and reinstated Amun to supremacy in Thebes. Tutankhamun lifted the ban on the cults of other gods and restored the traditional privileges of the priesthood. Many temples to the Aten in Thebes and elsewhere were torn down, and their painted bricks were used as filler in the walls of other temples. Everyone seemed to be in agreement. The whole sorry business of Akhenaten was better off forgotten. Today, the boy king Tutankhamun is perhaps the most famous of all the Egyptian pharaohs, more famous than the great Khufu and Khafre of Giza, or the pharaohs Djoser and Snefru, who perfected the pyramid form. He's more famous than Kamosa or Ahmosa, who reunited the kingdom and expelled the Hyksos, more famous than his colourful father Akhenaten, or the great queen Hatshepsut. But there's nothing in his reign that really warrants that level of recognition. In fact, this boy king died while still a teenager, after only 9 years of rule. He does seem to have been a good king, and popular, and set Egypt back on course after his father's erratic reign. But the source of his fame was really one of absolute historical accident. When he died in 1323 BC, the boy king Tutankhamun was buried in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It was not a particularly resplendent royal tomb, and a far cry from the glorious pyramids of the Old Kingdom. But shortly after it was sealed, there was a chance flash flood in this portion of the necropolis, and the doorway to the tomb was buried in sand and rock. This left it completely concealed. For the next 3,300 years, tomb robbers would scour the Valley of the Kings, stealing from nearly every one of the great pharaohs' tombs, making away with their treasures, removing their mummies, and despoiling their decorations. But buried in the sand, Tutankhamun's tomb remained sealed. For this reason, it was completely untouched until the year 1922, when it was uncovered by the Egyptologist Howard Carter, and all its artifacts were recovered to international astonishment. Today, the most glorious of these, the golden burial mask of Tutankhamun, is one of the most famous objects from the ancient world, a resplendent image of royal wealth and power. At times, it can be hard to remember that this golden image is also a portrait of a boy who had power thrust upon him in a time of upheaval and strife, looking up at us from the dark depths of the ages.
雖然我哋個個都唔同，但係可以全家人一齊慶祝龍年，就係最開心嘅事。
The new kingdom of Egypt would reach its highest point around 50 years after the reign of Tutankhamun. It would come during the rule of perhaps the greatest Egyptian pharaoh. He came to the throne under the name Ramesses II, but he would go down in history as Ramesses the Great. Ramesses came to the throne at the age of 14 in 1279 BC. At the time, Egypt's Mediterranean coast was being ravaged by groups of pirates, and he spent much of his early rule dealing with this nuisance. But he is most famous for pushing the boundaries of Egypt far to the north into the region of Syria. Over the preceding centuries, a powerful rival had grown up in the mountains of what is today Turkey, and was steadily spreading its influence in all directions. This was the powerful Hittite Empire, centered on their hill fortress capital of Hattusha. The Hittites were a relatively new power in the region, but their territory was wealthy and extensive. They had mastered the use of chariots in warfare, turning them from light hit-and-run vehicles into heavy armored shock troops. And for the last 2 centuries, Egypt had been fighting increasingly bitter wars with them over who would control the region of Palestine. In the 4th year of his reign, Ramses II gathered an expeditionary force and marched across the Sinai Desert to Gaza, and from there marched north. One epic poem written about this expedition exults in the enormous force that Ramses brought.
His Majesty journeyed northward, his infantry and chariotry with him. He began to march on the good way. Every foreign country was trembling before him. Their chiefs were bringing their tribute, and all the rebels were coming, bowing down through dread of the personality of His Majesty.
Ramesses' aim was to capture the strong fortress city of Kadesh, situated along the sandy banks on a fork of the Orontes River. For years now, Kadesh had been playing the Hittites and Egypt off against one another, allying first with one, then the other. Now, Ramesses was determined to finally seize Kadesh for Egypt. He marched north with 4 of his divisions, named after the gods Amun, Ra, Seth, and Ptah. With him, he brought thousands of chariots, and 1 unit of elite chariot riders he sent by sea, telling them to land on the coast and ride inland to meet him on the day that he arrived at Kadesh. At first, everything seemed to be going well. On his way, the pharaoh's scouts captured a pair of tribesmen from the Shasu people, who told him that the Hittite king was cowering further to the north. He was afraid of the might of Egypt, they said. He had left Kadesh defenseless. Excited by this news, Ramesses threw all caution to the wind and hastened northward to seize the city with only 1 of his 4 divisions, his prided Amun troops. But this would prove to be a fatal mistake. Ramesses didn't know it yet, but these Shasu tribesmen were actually agents of the Hittite king, sent to lure him into a trap. When he arrived at Kadesh, Ramesses set up his camp beside a stony brook, and his scouts set out into the surrounding landscape to detect any threats. Some of these scouts ran into a pair of Hittite soldiers who had been lying low in the undergrowth, watching them. They skirmished, and the Egyptians managed to capture the Hittites. After perhaps a stern beating, these men revealed what lay waiting for the Egyptians nearby: the full might of the Hittite armies amassed in an ambush, hidden behind the looming fortress of Kadesh. The Kadesh poem records this imposing force.
Now the wretched foe of Hatti had come, having gathered all foreign countries to the very ends of the sea, the land of Hatti in its entirety. They covered the mountains and the valleys like the grasshoppers with their multitudes. He left neither silver nor gold in his land, but despoiled it of all its possessions and gave them to all foreign countries to bring them with him to combat.
Ramesses flew into a rage with his generals for allowing this to happen. He had hurried ahead with his Amun division, and now he was critically overstretched, with his reinforcements in the Ra division still on the road. The Hittites would not allow the Egyptians to regroup. Before the Ra division could arrive, a terrifying force of 2,500 Hittite chariots burst out of hiding and swept across the river plain. Hittite chariots were the tanks of their day, heavy and armored, their riders covered in chainmail down to their toes. These chariots rolled in and smashed into the Ra regiment, who frantically tried to form a shield wall. The Hittites scattered this division completely and then rounded on the Egyptians' camp. Ramesses was surrounded, cut off from his reinforcements and now outnumbered. But in this dire situation, he recounts how he rallied his men and led them in a desperate charge against the enemy.
I found the 2,500 spans of chariotry, in whose midst I was, becoming heaps of corpses before my horses. Not one of them found his hand to fight, for their hearts quailed in their bodies from terror of me. And all their arms were powerless, so they could not shoot nor find their courage to seize their javelins.
Whether or not this self-aggrandizing account is an accurate depiction of that day, it's clear that the tide did begin to turn. The Egyptian soldiers were elite fighters, and many of the Hittite forces may have been mercenaries or conscripts. After destroying the Ra division and sweeping into the Egyptians' camp, the chariots became bogged down, and many of the Hittite soldiers, believing the battle to be already over, began looting rather than press their advantage. More Egyptian reinforcements were soon arriving from the south, and as the bloody afternoon wore on, That contingent of elite charioteers that had been sailing up the coast also arrived on the scene. The arrival of this cavalry on the horizon was enough to steel the resolve of the Egyptian troops and break the will of the Hittites. Ramesses gives a florid rendition of what happened next.
I made them plunge into the water as crocodiles plunge.